recorded.
And at this point, I'd like to turn our mic over to John Dowd, who's the moderator this afternoon, and he's from the University of Georgia. And I'll let John introduce himself, and then he'll introduce our presenter. John?
Yes. As you just heard, I'm John Dowd. I'm a hydrologist at the University of Georgia, sitting in for Todd Rasmussen, who should be doing this, but he's out of town today. I co-teach a course with Todd, so I frequently end up doing this. Today's speaker is Jon Chorover, who's a professor in soil, water, and environmental science at the University of Arizona. He's with the Environmental Biogeochemistry Group. He's the co-director of the Arizona Laboratory for Emerging Contaminants, and he's the principal investigator for the CZO we'll be hearing about today. He's been at Arizona since 2001, and before that, he was on the faculty at Penn State. His graduate degrees are from the University of California, Berkeley, and he also did a postdoc at the University of Geneva. His research interests include biogeochemistry, processes occurring in soil, sediment, and water. His laboratory group employs sophisticated analytical chemistry tools to investigate things from a field to laboratory scale, and he's especially interested in coupled biological and geochemical processes that influence form and mobility of various constituents in the near-surface environment. And with that, I will turn it over to John for his talk on the transformative behavior of water, energy, and carbon in the critical zone.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks also to Conrad for helping to set up today's meeting. And I'm pleased to be able to present this overview, really, of the Jemez-Santa Catalina Critical Zone Observatory, which is a collaboration among several principal investigators, postdocs, and students whose names I'll show you a little bit later on. So I'm really representing that group of interdisciplinary investigators in what I'm going to talk about here. But I know that many of you probably may have participated in last week's presentation by Suzanne Anderson, which was the first on the critical zone observatories, but I wanted to give just a little bit of background on the CZOs, which derived from a call that was sent out by the National Science Foundation in 2006 that indicated that processes occurring at or near the Earth's surface do not operate independently, but the extent to which they're coupled and on what temporal and spatial scales remains largely unknown, and that there's a need for natural laboratories where these terrestrial processes and systems can be studied through detailed field observations and in situ measurements. And they highlighted in that RFP that techniques from several disciplines really need to be coordinated to collect data sets that are spatially dense and temporally extended in the critical zone, and to address the integration and coupling of Earth's surface processes as mediated in particular by the presence and flux of fresh water. So I've underlined and kind of highlighted several aspects of this: the natural laboratories aspect, the need to integrate several disciplines, the need to provide data sets that are spatially dense and temporally extended, and that will in fact be made available to the community of Earth surface scientists to use, and to address the integration of these various different data sets. And so that's been the focus of our project, that in particular is located in the semi-arid southwestern United States. And why would one want a critical zone observatory in the southwestern U.S.? I think one reason is nicely depicted here, is that society in the Southwest is rapidly expanding. Population change is dramatically growing quickly in the southwestern U.S., as shown in this upper slide. And at the same time, global climate change predictions from global circulation models indicate that likely in this region of the Southwest there's going to be a significant decrease in precipitation, so an already water-limited environment is going to become increasingly water-limited with time. And so what we're seeing is a potential need to understand, in particular, the processes that regulate rainfall generation and delivery into aquifers that are utilized by this growing population. So that's sort of the societal relevance of why one might want an observatory in the montane Southwest, in the desert sort of sky islands, or the mountain ranges in the Southwest is where we get most of our water. Some of these issues were highlighted in a relatively recent proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which came out in December 14th, 2010, that highlighted a variety of issues related to this impending sort of decrease in rainfall that's likely to occur throughout the southwestern U.S. and the vulnerability that imposes on many of the growing metropolitan areas throughout this region as well. And some of those papers' titles are indicated here. So within that context of what's unique about the Southwest in respect to the critical zone, and I should probably back up just for a moment. I'm assuming that many folks are already familiar with the definition of the critical zone, but just in case that's not the case, the critical zone is defined as that portion of the Earth's terrestrial or land-based environment that extends from the upper boundary or the top of the vegetation canopy down to the lowest limits of the penetration of groundwater. And so it includes that whole part of the landscape that is impacted by the hydrologic cycle. And so within that context, the goals of the Jemez-Catalina CZO are to develop a cross-disciplinary, multi-scale natural laboratory for collaborative observation and modeling, and in particular with the goal of measuring the effects of climate, lithology or rock type, and disturbance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that disturbance aspect later because that's a recent addition to our goals, in terms of the variation in critical zone structure, function, and evolution in the water-limited southwestern U.S. And so we're focusing on, to do this, on environmental gradients that occur within watersheds, particularly within what we refer to as the sky islands in the Southwest, where most of the rainfall, because of orogenic processes, is occurring and delivering water to the basins. And we're interested in this for a variety of fundamental reasons, as well as for the implications that it has for environmental sustainability in this region of rapid population growth. Just a little bit about the structure of our CZO in terms of personnel, and I said I was going to mention the names of several of the folks that are involved. I can show them here, and I'm trying to grab my arrow. I can't grab my arrow for some reason, but that's okay. Within this dark green cells over here, you can see the names of the investigators in our CZO, and each of these investigators brings with them a certain type of expertise with respect to Earth surface processes, ranging from ecology to groundwater hydrology. We also have, I'm a lead PI along with Peter Trope in the hydrology department here at the University of Arizona. We have an executive committee that comprises Paul Brooks, John Pelletier, Craig Rasmussen, and Jen McIntosh, who are also here at the University of Arizona. So much of our leadership's at the University of Arizona, but we do have collaborators at other universities, including, for example, Enrique Vavoni, who's at Arizona State University, where we have a team of students and postdocs that include graduate students and undergraduates that are working on the project, as well as field technicians, data manager, and we're involved in public outreach through Biosphere 2. We also interact with this light blue box, the CZO steering committee that oversees all 6 of the CZOs that are involved in the national program, and the leadership of that are the CZO PIs. We have a cross-CZO coordinator and cross-CZO data management team, and we're also consistently reaching out to prospective investigators like many of yourselves perhaps on the phone that could potentially be interested in doing research at the CZOs, and we would welcome folks to do and take advantage of the growing infrastructure associated with the CZOs as we go forward. The locations of our CZOs are in 2 locations. In fact, we're one of the only CZOs that has sort of 2 principal locations for the research that we do. One is in northern New Mexico, north of Albuquerque, west of Santa Fe, in what's the Jemez Mountains or the Jemez River Basin. And this CZO builds on an ecohydrologic observatory that was initiated under NSF Science and Technology Center funding. That was called SARA. And the other part of the observatory is here closer to Tucson in southern Arizona, labeled here as SCM, or the Santa Catalina Mountains. And this builds on some seed funding that was established at the University of Arizona, where some similar instrumentation was installed prior to really getting the CZO going. So we have a little bit of history at a lower level of instrumentation prior to the installation of the CZOs. But the main goal is to span, by using these 2 locations, both of which are elevation gradients, is to span a large climate and lithology parameter space in the semi-arid southwestern United States. If we sort of zero in here, focus in on the locations of both the Jemez River Basin on the left and the Santa Catalina Mountain site on the right at a similar scale. We're focused in the Jemez River Basin on what's known as the Valles Caldera National Preserve. This is a preserve that comprises it looks like now I grabbed my arrow. I've been working on that for a while. I finally got my arrow. So this is the caldera rim of the Valles Caldera National Preserve. This is a volcano that erupted and has a variety of resurgent domes that you see here, as well as a breach in the caldera rim wall, which gives rise to the east fork of the Jemez River, shown here. And so we're focusing on this preserve in the Jemez River Basin. And then in the Santa Catalina Mountains, the elevation gradient is shown here, extending from 600 meters elevation up to about 3,600 meters, or not quite that high, but 3,400, 3,300 meters in elevation in the Santa Catalina Mountains. And we also show here some of the sites that we are doing intensive work at, as indicated by these white outlined areas, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the coming slides. Before I do that, though, I want to let you know about our sort of conceptual model that we have for how the critical zone functions and evolves. that we're trying to test in the context of our observatory. And as I indicated, the critical zone is defined as this zone of the Earth's near surface that extends from the upper boundary of vegetation, or the lower boundary of the atmosphere, down to the lower limits of groundwater penetration, which of course remains poorly known and poorly defined in many cases through fractured bedrock. And it includes the ecosystem that sits on top of the soil and unsaturated and vado zone, and down into the saturated zone as well. And it's part of, in this case, showing sort of a cross-section, it's part of a larger landscape feature. And what we're interested in is how energy and matter influx in terms of radiation, water, and carbon is then partitioned and transported along critical zone gradients, ultimately giving rise to dissipative products, chemical and physical denudation products, sediments, solutes, gases, and latent heat that are released from the critical zone and give rise, in the context of open system thermodynamics, if you're familiar with thinking about open systems in this way, give rise to an entropy increase in the surroundings. And that can give rise to an increased organizational structure within the system. In this case, in terms of this organizational structure within the system that we're most interested in relates to secondary mineral formation, soil organic matter stabilization, the formation of structured aggregates, the formation of structured flow paths, preferential flow paths, and ultimately landscape evolution, the formation of valley densities and hollows and the like. And we're developing a quantitative approach to the forcing factor of that evolution of the critical zone that we refer to as effective energy and mass transfer, or the EEMT model. And what the EEMT model does is it incorporates an effective precipitation term and an effective carbon assimilation term, if you will, or photosynthate production term, to derive the energy that is delivered into the subsurface of the critical zone. And drives many of the reactions of interest. And what this does is it takes meteorological variables and incorporates them into a single energy flux parameter that has units of watts per meter squared, or kilojoules per meter squared per second. And therefore, these climatic parameters that tend to drive critical zone evolution that are typically separated out into precipitation and temperature, for example, can be incorporated into this single energy flux term. Excuse me. So when we begin to, one of the first activities of our project was to map that forcing factor over the surfaces of our sites, and those are shown here. And you can see that our EEMT ranges are very large for the Santa Catalina mountain site, which is shown here on the left, and quite a bit narrower, but nonetheless significant in the Jemez River Basin site on the right, extending from up to about 50 megajoules per meter squared per year in terms of sort of the energy flux units that we're using to calculate what we say are driving critical zone evolution. And again, this is one of our hypotheses, is that we can quantify critical zone evolution by using this EEMT parameter. Details of that, the derivation of that EEMT parameter are discussed in the paper that was cited in the previous slide. But we've already shown that EEMT does enable better prediction of key critical zone formation processes, such as the development of regolith depth, regolith being weathered bedrock and the overlying mobile soil, which is shown here, or depicted here from a paper by John Pelletier, a geomorphologist, and Craig Rasmussen in our group, where EEMT is used as a predictor to help develop this P0 term, which is the soil production function for a soil-free landscape over rock in a given climate and lithology space. And of course, soil depth formation, the height of the soil profile or the height of the regolith, the depth of regolith, is a function of the rate at which it is produced and the rate at which it is eroded from the landscape. And knowing this P0 term is essential in order to be able to predict the depth of regolith. And what John Pelletier's group, our geomorphologist, has been showing is that by incorporating this consideration of EEMT into calculations of regolith production, we can better predict the rates of soil formation. So that's been promising in that respect. So the overarching research question that guides the design of our critical zone observatory is how does variability in climate, lithology, disturbance influence critical zone structure and function. And we're interested in that structure and function evolution over both long time scales, such as those that would be associated with landscape evolution, and also short time scales, such as those that might characterize a hydrologic event or the response of a landscape to a hydrologic event. The way we're addressing that overarching question is through what we characterize as 4 thematic science areas that we are integrating in our CZO. Those 4 thematic areas are ecohydrology and hydrologic partitioning, landscape evolution, so this is sort of the long time scale evolution of a landscape geomorphically, subsurface biogeochemistry, which is the complex of biologically and chemically driven weathering processes that give rise to changes in the landscape at the grain to catchment scale. And all of these, of course, are integrated and reflected in surface water dynamics. And these four areas shown here are focusing in particular on water, carbon, and weathering fluxes in our CZO. Those are the principal interests that we have, how water, carbon, and weathering fluxes are related to these various thematic areas. And as you can imagine, these various thematic areas are represented in our project by people that come from various disciplines such as geomorphology, geochemistry, hydrology, ecology, etc. In terms of exploring this parameter space that's been that we've identified in these sky islands, if you will, we're looking at sky islands in both the Santa Catalina Mountains and also the Jemez River Basin. And these sky islands, the elevation gradients that they comprise, allow us to move through on basically a given bedrock type and bedrock age. They allow us to move through a variety of ecosystems and a variety of EEMT values or climate locations as we go up in elevation. And so in the Santa Catalina Mountains, mean annual temperatures range from 18 degrees in the valley floor up to down to 11 degrees C at the top of the mountain. Mean annual precipitation goes from 0.4 meters at the base up to 0.8 meters at the top. The lithology, or the bedrock type in the Santa Catalina Mountains, is granite and schist, so we can actually compare the development of critical zone processes on those 2 different bedrock types. And these are both within the larger watershed of the Santa Cruz River, which ultimately feeds into the Colorado River. In the Jemez River Basin, the mean annual temperatures are a bit lower, but they pick up right where the Santa Catalina Mountains left off here in terms of temperature. They go from 11 degrees to 3 degrees C, so they extend our climate gradient. The mean annual precipitations are comparable to what we see in the Santa Catalina Mountains, and the lithology is different. The rock type is rhyolite, and these are within the larger Rio Grande watershed. The locations where we're installing intensive instrumentations are shown here. We're installing these in what we call zero-order basins, or small catchments, where we can look at catchment integrated processes in our B2 desert site, Oracle Ridge site, which is a transition from mesquite and pinyon juniper into ponderosa pine, and a Marshall Gulch site, which is mixed conifer forest. In the Jemez River Basin, we're focusing again at the upper elevations of the Jemez River Basin to date, and we've been looking at a mixed conifer site. And most recently, we've installed instrumentation in a recently burned, so these are flames from our forest fire, East Rabbit site, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. So what do these zero-order basin installations involve? Typically, they involve instrumentation of a variety of types for real-time sensing and sampling from canopy to surface and groundwater. And we include eddy covariance flux towers. So we have a couple of flux towers at each of our sites, phenocams to be able to get a sense of changes in the above-ground vegetation, sap flow monitors to be able to get direct measures of evapotranspiration, to be related to eddy covariance flux measurements, vadose zone and saturated zone samplers for chemistry and isotopes, soil moisture and water potential samplers that are co-located with those chemistry samplers, and flumes and ISCO samplers as well. Here are the instrumented hill slope diagrams, and I know these are not necessarily really easy to see, but these are for each of our sites in the Santa Catalina Mountains. In the Marshall Gulch, the upper elevation site, we have a hill slope or so one of these small catchments in granite, and then also another one that's in a schist location. We have granite sites also in the B2 desert site and in the Oracle Ridge, the mid-elevation site. Each of these sites contains, again, this variety of instrumentation that I discussed in the previous slide. Here are instrumented hill slopes for the Jemez River Basin, where you can see instrumentation installed in our mixed conifer site here on the left, and then also a mixed conifer site that was recently burned on the right-hand side. This burn occurred in this past summer, June and July, really, of 2011. Sorry. And I will, again, come back to that shortly. Now I just want to give you a brief overview of some of the types of data sets that we're generating in these sites. Here, focusing mostly on the mixed conifer zero-order basin in the Jemez River Basin, but also I'll show some data from some of the other locations. One of the things that we have done recently as part of an NSF-wide effort across the CZOs is collected LIDAR data that can be used to provide detailed information on the conditions of both sort of topographic and conditions of the near surface, as well as the vegetation canopy. And it can also provide information on snow depth if LIDAR data are collected during snowfall and during the maximum snow depth, and then also after snowmelt. So this slide shows a depiction of snow depth associated with different locations within our zero-order basin in the mixed conifer location, which is, again, one of these highly instrumented locations. And it shows that snow depth varies depending upon which side, essentially, of vegetation canopies you are looking at. On the southern, a nice example is, for example, right here, the southern side of vegetation canopies, much lower snow depth due to sublimation. This is at maximum snowpack, versus the northern side of the vegetation canopy due to radiation input. So LIDAR provides us with a very nice snapshot in time of the snow depth distribution that is presumably characteristic of high snowpack in our zero-order basin, and its distribution relates to aspect variation and also vegetation distribution in the basin. We're also collecting data, as I said, using phenocam. So here's some phenocam data showing that in the mixed conifer forest of the Jemez River Basin site, that same site I just showed you, there's a big increase in the greenness index, which can be seen actually as you're looking at 3 different phenocam locations that take snapshots of particular locations in the zero order basin. There's a large increase in the greenness, as you can see, from May to August in these figures, again from May to August, that can be quantified on the basis of image analysis. And so there's a big increase, of course, in greenness and plant growth, particularly in the understory, beginning in April and May. And that can be correlated as well with some of our sap flow measurements, plant water uptake that occur at that same period of time, that are initiated basically in early spring and continue through the snow melt period. This big greenness increase is largely due to the penetration of water into the soil associated with that snow melt. These are, again, water-limited vegetation types and ecosystems. Here are some data collected from eddy covariance flux towers. If you look at the left panels, these are from the mixed conifer site as well, that show that associated with that same greenness, this increase in greenness that we saw on the previous slide beginning in about April, the ecosystem, as measured from the eddy covariance flux towers, become a significant sink of carbon. Carbon is absorbed into the ecosystem through net uptake of carbon dioxide and photosynthesis. Carbon is fixed into the biomass and released into the soils, particularly if the ecology is in steady state. And we see that this coincides as well with a rapid increase in evapotranspiration from the vegetation. And so the snowmelt period is characterized by this increase in greenness, this dramatic uptake of carbon, and this increase in evapotranspiration. Of soil moisture as well. One of the things we're most interested in is when this carbon is translocated into the soil. How is it partitioned into, for example, weathering processes, stabilized carbon, dissolved organic matter, and carbon dioxide effluxes? And so here, just to show an example, actually these data are from the Santa Catalina mountain site, show some carbon dioxide flux data for both granite and schist comparison in the Marshall Gulch catchment as a function of time. And so we're making these types of measurements both spatially, looking at spatial variation in the field of CO2 evolution from the soil, and also DOC flux through the soil, or the partitioning of that carbon into different soil carbon pools as a function of season. That's resulting from this increase in net ecosystem exchange, carbon uptake by the system. Now, that the ultimate fate of the carbon depends a lot on, as many of us involved in biogeochemistry of soils know, the texture of the soils. And so we collect data pertaining to the texture of the soils when we do our equipment installations. Here are data for 6 different pedons within that zero-order basin in the Jemez River site that show the distribution. I'm sorry, this image didn't come out very well in this display, but clay, silt, and sand size fractions for 6 different pedons or soil profiles in the catchment. And what we expect is that this variation in texture will also reflect a variation in the carbon uptake and carbon sequestration within the soils, typically higher carbon sequestration being associated with greater clay fraction. In addition, this type of patterning associated with texture is likely to be reflected in the chemistry of soil pore waters, which are depicted here. These are PET-on solution chemistry profiles for those same 6 locations, derived in this case from water extracts of the soils. And again, this is another image that did not come out very well in the transfer of the transfer of the PowerPoint into Adobe for some reason. But suffice it to say that what we're looking at here are charge balance diagrams for solution chemistry as a function of depth through the soil profile. And what you can see is that there's clear patterning in terms of a change in those the chemistry of the profile of the pore waters as you descend into the deeper part of the soil profile, and that there's also a change in the typical components of that mass balance or charge balance on the soil pore waters. In particular, we observe that organic acids, again, deriving OA, shown in all of these organic acids comprise a significant proportion of the total charge balance or the total anion charge in these soil solutions. And we think that these organic acids, which are biologically generated, again, as a result of this net ecosystem uptake of carbon, are important for driving the weathering processes that release many of these other cations like aluminum and iron, magnesium into solution and translocate them off-site as part of the weathering of the catchment. Here are some data showing soil temperature results across the catchment in these 6 different locations as well, and at 3 different depths. These are continuous data that are logged by our data loggers on soil temperature at, in this case, 12, 37, and 57 centimeters of depth, but the depths vary a little bit between the different samplers. But you can see, for example, the attenuation of the temperature variation with increasing depth in the soil profile. And this temperature variation reflects, of course, the seasonality and the snowpack. As we said earlier, the snow melt and the penetration of snow melt waters into the soil appear to drive much of the biology of the system and the carbon uptake. And so it's very important to have data pertaining to the volumetric water content of the soils, and those are shown in this slide, which show, again, time variation in soil water content. Here's the month of January, again, with snowmelt initiating in April. There's a very large and rapid increase in volumetric water content, followed by its slow descent due to soil drying, and this associates directly with those sap flow measurements and evapotranspiration measurements that I showed you earlier. Importantly, we're also measuring water potential associated with sorry, I get distracted trying to find my arrow each time. But we're also looking at water potential, which of course directly relates to volumetric water content through the soil water characteristic curve that can be developed, in fact, through comparing these 2 data sets. But matrix potential is shown here, increasingly negative matrix potential as we go up on the y-axis here. Again, during snowmelt, what we see is that at 2 different depths, we're approaching 0 matrix potential or saturated soils, and this is fairly consistent across many of our sensor locations throughout the catchment, that during snowmelt, the soils become saturated, which would give rise, presumably, to lateral flows in the catchment, in addition to vertical fluxes of water, and an overall increase in the hydrological connectivity of the catchment. And so we're very interested in beginning to relate these point measurements, if you will, within the catchment to integrated surface water dynamics measurements that are measured at the catchment outlet. And so some of the work being done is to address the dynamics of the isotopic chemistry and the age of water emanating from the catchment outlet. Peter Trove, for example, in his group is very interested in using oxygen-18 and deuterium isotopes to characterize what is called the transit time distribution, which is shown here of water. Transit time distribution refers to the time it takes for a packet or a molecule, if you will, of water to pass from precipitation input to the catchment to the catchment outlet. And this is the distribution or probability distribution of catchment transit times for 3 different events in 2007 from the Marshall Gulch site. And one can develop from that ensemble of data a master transit time distribution function, which is shown here, which indicates that the transit time distributions range from very short times, or the transit times, I'm sorry, range from very short times to relatively long times for water to get from precipitation to the catchment outlet. And that presumably some of the shorter transit times are associated with those periods when we have hydrologic connectivity within the catchment associated with saturation of the near surface soils. Mean values for transit time for the Marshall Gulch catchment are on the order of 141 days, as shown here. Now, this connectivity turns out to be quite important in terms of how the hydrologic processes drive the discharge of carbon and associated lithogenic or rock-derived elements. Here we see the discharge curves or the hydrographs for 4 different catchments in the Jemez River Basin. And when discharge is highest, as indicated by this gray curve, we also see high values of DOC. So this is consistent with saturation of the near surface soils and discharge of organic carbon into the streams. And so we're interested in knowing what the influence of that is on lithogenic element release or chemical weathering of our catchments. Here are some data that provide us some information on that. When we have an increase in dissolved organic carbon concentrations in the streams, that is when discharge is high and the catchment hydrology is connected, if you will, we see our largest effluxes of several lithogenic or rock-derived elements, including iron, aluminum, and also several trace elements, the rare earth elements. Whereas for silicon, which does not form strong complexes as silicic acid with dissolved organic carbon, we do not see a significant, say, biological weathering effect on the release of these elements. Now, finally, and I'm speeding up just a bit because I see that I'm running a bit over time. I want to wrap up and give time for questions. But I did mention that we're interested in the disturbance effects that are occurring as well in these systems. The most important disturbance effects in montane environments in the Southwest and in the West in general is wildfire. And very interestingly, this past summer, after our CZO was established, our CZO was significantly in the Jemez River Basin. Here's that caldera rim that we looked at earlier with the resurgent domes. This is a satellite image of right after ignition of a very large wildfire that turned out to be the largest wildfire in New Mexico history. Started right within our critical zone observatory on the 26th of June. And it resulted in the burning of 635 square kilometers. Again, here's that caldera wall. The area that was burned is shown here. So a large portion of the observatory was burned, a large portion even of the catchment that feeds into the east fork of the Jemez River was burned. And so we had to make the decision of whether our observatory would now try to include an investigation into this burn effect on critical zone processes. And we decided pretty quickly to move forward to invest some of our resources in studying the burn effects. These burn effects were highly variable spatially, as shown here. Some areas, just the understory was burned and the trees seemed to survive. Other areas, it was complete crown-replacing wildfire, and a moonscape was created through very high-intensity burns. And so we have installed some instrumentation to examine this. Subsequent to the burn, some of the most exciting geomorphological events in the CZO that we would be likely to observe occurred, as shown here. Flooding events resulted in very large episodic sediment transport events. John Pelletier has used ground-based LIDAR with his student Caitlin Oram to map some of the new sediment transport, sediment fans that resulted from some of these large areas of shallow flow. You can see this example right here, which is all new sediment that was discharged from some of the upland catchments. So arguably, some of the most important geomorphology in terms of landscape evolution was occurring in association with a rainfall event just following forest fire that swamps some of the much smaller sediment transport events that occur throughout non-disturbance years. So to conclude, our critical zone observatories are facilitating a collaborative and interdisciplinary approach to Earth surface science. Ours today was just an example. The Jemez-Santa Catalina CZO, for example, is testing the hypothesis that carbon and water inputs to and transfers within the Earth's surface affect the long-term evolution of critical zone structure and its event-based function. And I also want to highlight that all of you and other investigators involved in Earth surface processes are invited to make use of this CZO network that is developing in situ instrumentation for both research and education. Our data sets are going to be placed online for the community to make use of, but we also encourage investigators to actually conduct field-based research using the CZOs as their natural laboratories. And to get more information, we encourage you to visit this website, criticalzone.org. Finally, I want to acknowledge the graduate students and postdoctoral researchers involved in our project, and also the funding from the National Science Foundation's Critical Zone Observatories program, which provides funding for all 6 of the CZOs. And thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has now.
Thank you, John. That was a really interesting presentation. And we'll now open it to questions. You can either unmute your phone and ask a question directly, or type it into the chat box and we'll relay it. If nobody else has a question, I'll start it off. The Valles Caldera has several hot springs, and not very big, but there's obviously a subsurface upwards energy flux in that area. Is that incorporated in your energy model, or thought to be necessary to incorporate in your energy model?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, the northern part of the Valles Caldera National Preserve, there's a watershed that gives rise to Redondo Creek, which is impacted by geothermal waters and geothermal activity. And although we don't at present have instrumentation installed on that side of the preserve, we do examine frequently that we use Redondo Creek as one of our streams that we're monitoring and studying sort of geochemical and stream water dynamics in. And we do need to incorporate an understanding of the geothermal contributions. The extent to which we need to incorporate those types of contributions to our EEMT model would depend on where we're applying it. We haven't yet because we're not studying intensively catchments that are strongly geothermally impacted. But certainly if we were, we would need to do that. You're right.
All right. If there are other people who have questions, please jump in. No? All right. It's clear that snow is an important aspect of your hydrologic processes, and it's, elevationally, there's an elevation gradient with it. At what level do you think that it no longer drives the hydrology by, say, having a a saturated zone, subsurface zone when you're in the middle of snowmelt? Do you see, or do you think you'd see a shift in how the system behaves, and and thus how weathering occurs?
Yes, that absolutely. It appears from the data that we have so far. Again, we installed our soil moisture probes in some of these high elevation catchments just last year, so we have one snowmelt period thus far to be able to refer to within the CZO proper. We do see that that during snowmelt period, there's basically there are two periods of significant precipitation in both of these environments, and I should have mentioned that perhaps. One is the snowpack in the high elevation sites that occurs during the winter. Of course, in the low elevation sites, we also get precipitation during the winter, but it's nominally as winter rains. So we have the winter precipitation period, and we also have a summer precipitation period in both of these sites associated with monsoon rainfalls. And what we see is that the greatest sort of impact of precipitation on the development of saturation within the subsurface occurs during the snowmelt period, and not during the summer monsoons. There is this dramatic increase in soil moisture that occurs during snowmelt, as anybody would expect in these high elevation sites, but it's sustained over a relatively long time frame, and that's also the time period over which we get the highest discharges in our streams. At the same time, as we're getting the highest discharges in our streams of water, we're seeing the highest concentrations of dissolved organic carbon and also of several lithogenic elements. Not all of them, but several of them. The ones that seem to increase in concentration during that snowmelt period and that reflect weathering processes in the subsurface are those metals that form strong complexes with the organic matter. So we think that what's happening there is actually that the organic matter is driving the weathering during the snowmelt. There's a big pulse of this dissolved organic matter down through the weathering profile that's associated with the snowmelt. There's complexation reactions that occur between the DOM and these rock-derived metals, and the chemical denudation of the landscape that occurs during that period is very significant for those metals. For several other metals that don't form strong complexes with organic matter, such as calcium and magnesium, we don't see that type of relationship. And those types of metals tend to be diluted during the snowmelt period. So there is a stoichiometric effect, if you will, of snowmelt on the nature of the chemical denudation that's occurring.
Thank you. We have a typed-in question from Joel Moore. Thanks for the talk. Do you see a correlation between soil thickness and elevation?
Yes, that's a great question. In fact, we do. What I mentioned early on in the talk was that there was that elevation, as we go up in elevation, we tend to go up significantly in precipitation. And although temperatures decrease with increasing elevation, precipitation increases significantly and vegetation changes. And we see more extensive chemical weathering, and I would really say chemical weathering and a deeper soil profile as you go up in elevation. So soil depth does increase with elevation, and that's correlated also with an increase in this parameter that we're calling EEMT, or our climate forcing variable. So indeed, we do see an increase in soil depth with increasing elevation.
And we have another question. This was from David Goodrich. What is the planned, keeps jumping here, what is the planned operational length of the CZO?
Well, NSF funded 6 CZOs, if those of you who may have heard Suzanne Anderson's talk last week perhaps heard, I think she was going to cover a little more of the background on the CZO program. But the way it worked was in 2006 they sent out this RFP. They funded 3 CZOs in 2007 that were the first CZOs to be funded. Those were Boulder Creek, Southern Sierra, and Shale Hills CZOs. And those CZOs were funded for 5 years. And so they are, their initial funding was for 5 years, so that was 2007. So in 2012 would be when their initial grants would be coming to a close. Then in 2009, NSF funded 3 more CZOs from that same 2007 competition, and those CZOs were the Luquillo CZO in Puerto Rico, the Christina River Basin CZO in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and our CZO, which is in Arizona, New Mexico. And again, we have 5 years of funding from the National Science Foundation. Of course, the investment in infrastructure and time and long-term data sets, we would all hope that there might be options for further funding beyond that 5-year period.
Right. Peter asks, actually a question I had as well, what instrumentation are you using for matrix potential measurements?
We are using the Decagon matrix potential probes, which they're not tensiometers, which is the traditional way to measure matrix potential, of course, but where Decagon has probes, I think they're, I forget the model number of the Decagon matrix potential probes, but they are actually probes that are providing continuous data logging, and they're co-located with Decagon soil moisture probes, which I think are the 5TM. Or those may be the matrix potential probes.
Okay.
I'd be happy to get back to you. If you want to send me an email, I can send you that information directly.
Yeah, I will do that, and anybody else is interested will, I'm sure, do it as well. Joel Moore asks, does precipitation tend to be the predominant driver of the EEMT increase with elevation?
Yes, absolutely. Precipitation increase because, as you can imagine, temperature decreases, and so the temperature decrease does not contribute to an increase in EEMT. It actually contributes to a decrease in EEMT. So the principal driver for the increase in EEMT with elevation is precipitation, and particularly that portion of precipitation that is in excess of potential evapotranspiration, and that can penetrate into the subsurface to drive these weathering reactions. So, so that occurs, of course, seasonally in association with things like snowmelt, where you get that precipitation in excess of potential evapotranspiration.
All right. Does anybody else have a verbal question? Just jump in, or I'll actually ask one other question that's sort of goes beyond what Joel Moore had asked earlier about elevation and soil thickness. Do you see a relationship between, or a difference in subsurface flux or runoff from that's related to the thickness of the soil?
Yeah, we do see some differences, definitely in terms of response that relates to the thickness of the soils. And I'd say that, for example, our B2 desert site, which is at our lowest elevation, where the soils are thinnest, and in fact, it's extremely difficult to collect, subsurface vadose zone samples with the same types of moisture samplers as above, because the hydrology of those systems is extremely flashy, and the conductivity of the soils is extremely high. So when we get an event in the desert, we get very rapid flushing and very rapid response. As we go up in elevation, the time lag between a precipitation event and stream flow response increases. And there is a relationship with soil depth that's been nicely shown by some of the work that's been, again, bringing together disciplines within our CZO that relate to soil depth, an understanding of how soil depth develops from geomorphology, and also the hydrologic measurements that are being done by others in the group, in that with increasing soil depth, there is an increase in the transit time of water through a catchment, and so of equivalent size. And so there is a relationship that's been defined on the basis of water isotopes through some of Peter Choke's work in collaboration with some other folks. There's been a relationship that's been shown to occur both in the Jemez River Basin as a function of aspect, which gives rise to variation in soil depth, and also in the Santa Catalina Mountains, where we have soil depths being different in the schist site. Soils are deeper versus the granite site where soils are shallower. We again see longer transit times for deeper soils in both of those sites.
Yes, that's very interesting because that's the same response that they've seen in zero-order basin experimental watersheds in Japan, where the deeper soils take longer to respond.
Ah, interesting. And those are volcanic-derived soils,
yes.
I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would like to look at those papers. That's interesting.
Yeah, Roy Seidel.
Ah, okay. Great.
Number of papers on it. He has actually a fairly recent one in hydrologic processes, I think.
Super. Thank you.
I only know that because I saw his talk yesterday on it.
Ah, cool. That's great.
Well, are there any other questions?
Love to hear some voices on the other end.
Yeah.
But if not, that's okay too.
Everybody's shy today, I guess.
Hi, this is Joel Moore again.
Hey, Joel.
How's it going, John?
Good.
So you said the schist soils, or the soils in the schist catchment tend to be deeper. Is that a mineralogy thing, or what's driving the difference depth between the soils?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, some of the work that Craig Rasmussen is doing in the CZO has shown that, and John Pelletier, they've shown that the soils in the schist bedrock types are in fact deeper than in granite, and we attribute this to the much greater sort of mass concentration of micaceous minerals, particularly biotite, in the schist. That tends to lead to more rapid overall weathering and soil depth formation on the schist versus the granite. So yes, I think that the soil depth difference at equivalent climate, or EEMT, if you will, and roughly the same ecology and biotic drivers, we're getting more rapid soil depth formation in the schist relative to the granite, and that's largely mineralogically driven.
Are there any other questions? Anybody else wants to jump in? Well, I'll ask one more question.
Yeah.
You said that I think it was Peter was using stable isotopes to look at that transit time. A traditional way that stable, isotopes of oxygen and deuterium were used to in hydrology was with snowmelt. And have you looked at the deeper waters from an isotopic point of view to see principally what kind of waters actually make it there?
You mean
from a recharge point of view?
Right. We have just begun to start looking at that. We're only now. Others, for example, have looked at stable water isotopes at the scale of the Tucson Basin, for example, and the isotopic composition of water in the basin itself. We have only now begun starting to get to that point where we haven't yet actually begun to drill deeper wells in the upper